So tell us a little bit about that, kind of mapping out data, and what are the considerations that people need to think about starting out?
Yeah, it's where to start is always the hardest, right, for everybody. And to your point, there's one more step you could do before that most people don't. And you think about, do I build it purpose-built or do I retrofit what I got, right? Mm-hmm. So because that's going to drive your boundary diagrams and your data flow diagrams and all those other things. We say internally, if you can't draw it, you're not going to be able to secure it, right? Because you don't know what you got. You don't know what you're doing. If you can't draw a picture of it and draw a picture of it from memory, then you're not going to understand how the pieces work, where things flow, what's important, where controls actually apply. Because you're going to read a control and you're going to like, that doesn't make sense to me, because you don't understand your architecture enough to be able to apply what it's saying to go do, even though there's examples and there's lots of things out there to tell you on how to apply some piece of compliance or cybersecurity to it. But if you don't understand what you got, then you're starting negative already.
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Kenny Scott. I am the host of the Paramify podcast. Today, we have with us Mike Schreiner.
Happy to be here.
COO extraordinaire at Paramify. And today we are honored to have our good friend and partner and just awesome guru with us, Jason Ford, CEO, founder of Steel Patriot Partners. We're so pumped to have you here, man. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, glad I made the trip out west, first time in Salt Lake. So definitely an experience and happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. It's a little colder this week. It was warm.
Yeah.
You said it was 82 degrees when you left Virginia.
Unreasonably warm in Virginia for early November, but yeah, 82 when I left yesterday. Landed in Denver. It was snowing 25. Got here and I think it was 28 or something like that. It was no snow.
You said you didn't have your coat on.
No coat. Yeah, growing up in the mountains of Western PA, mountains, quote unquote, of Western PA. That's 3,000 feet is no longer a mountain for you guys, but. Used to that, right? And you get here, it's a different kind of cold.
Yep,
for sure.
You got the full Utah welcome treatment with 45 minutes on I-15 in traffic. So
yeah,
welcome.
Yeah, exactly. It's any interstate in this country at this point through a major metropolitan area.
Ah, dude, the Rocky Mountains, brought to you by John Denver.
Take him back to West Virginia and sing about country roads.
That's right.
Yeah.
Sometimes we break out into song at Paramify, sing some country road.
Yep, sometimes.
And then, DJ Khaled, a lot of.
We have a song. We have a song in our hearts, and we're not going to keep it there.
That's right. We've gotten a lot of feedback from our listeners, and a lot of the value that they get is how do we actually look at security, and how do we make this easier? How do we make it more approachable? Paramify's mission is to make risk management approachable for anyone. Kind of like Ratatouille, right? Anyone could cook. Not everybody should, right? Because their heart's not in it. But risk management is a really tough problem. And we've spent our life in cyber and in tech, and we've seen a lot of things over the years that make it a lot easier. And so we have been talking a lot about this. You can't stuff a turkey through a beak, right?
Good analogy.
Right? Yeah. If you start any math equation that starts wrong, well, that's going to be wrong no matter how elaborate the changes you make later on, right? You need to start right. And if you start right, it's just going to be so much better off. And so that's a lot of our focus is our clients with our partners. How do we start right? So first off, we talk about, risks. What is a risk? Risk is what? Threat plus the vulnerability and the impact that that's going to have on an organization. So there's obviously in cyber, there are so many threats, always evolving, but there are some tried and true ways to approach some of those. And so Jason, today you said you wanted to talk a little bit about, we're going to talk encryption. We're going to talk FIPS. Why is that important? We're going to talk, what else? What did you say? You said vulnerability management. You said we'd talk a little bit about Help me out, guys. Help me out. Vulnerability management, you said.
Yeah, it's FIPS, vulnerability management, just how to put stuff in place. IAM, like
access.
It's all the stuff that people don't want to think about that
Yeah.
then comes and bites them when they go through an audit, right? It's
Yeah.
the idea.
Yeah. So I kind of gave away what we're going to talk about later, but Jason, how did you get into security? And tell us a little bit about your organization and the common things
I'll
you
keep
do.
this short because I always look at podcasts and webinars, all that kind of stuff. It's not about the person talking about it. It's more about the content that you're talking about, right? Let the content speak. So I dumb luck, let's call it. Was fortunate enough to graduate as an electrical engineer as an undergrad. Went to got a couple job offers in the steel mill industry, and then ultimately ended up in Northern Virginia and went into the bureau as a consultant for 6 years. So worked at FBI headquarters for a number of years. Got to do some really cool stuff during a digital transformation in the late 90s, early 2000s that a lot of people didn't get to see.
Digital transformation before it was cool.
Literally agents using paper and pencil versus a mouse and a keyboard, right? So think about that from an agent's perspective, someone who's in their 60s at that point in time. Technology is still new. Keyboards and mice were not something that anyone wanted to use, right? It's my filing cabinet with my files inside of it. It is what it is, right? So that's kind of where I got in my early 20s and my mid 20s. That's where I got to start. Got exposed to FISMA there in the early days before all this other crazy stuff that we deal with today existed. Kind of went through that, learned that I didn't want to do that for any longer. Took a swing for the fences. .com boom, early 2000s happened. Worked at a startup for 9 months. That failed. And then went to another company. And
Weird.
It's called Haymax was the name of the company. They did bulletin boards and sort of like in-person live town halls with sports people. So like the Dallas Stars were one of their customers. So
nice.
Like got to do a couple things with a couple Dallas Stars hockey players at the time. So that was pretty cool. But that didn't take off. 9 months later, that was out. Went and then built a platform to sell EE and Patriot bonds for the Treasury. And we did all the bank transactions. So if you bought a Patriot bond or a EE bond in 2002 through 4, that was our platform is the one that did that. Before PCI was a thing.
That's a good time to buy bonds.
It was. A lot of people, surprisingly in that space, like people would buy $5,000 bonds with a credit card and just use that, right, as an investment vehicle because at that point they were lucrative enough to do that. Obviously they ebb and flow over time, but at that point it was something that was valuable. So we settled all the credit card transactions with like Fifth Third Bank and Bank of America for the Treasury. So before PCI was a thing, right? So kind of built that. And then started my own company in 2004. It was called Black Mesh. We focused on CMS, basically publicly facing websites. Drupal was our focus, and then WordPress.
Drupal?
Drupal.
Oh
WordPress
my gosh,
after
I
that.
remember Drupal.
Yeah, it's still around.
Yeah.
A lot of people still use it.
Yeah.
And then 2010-ish, Department of Energy became one of my customers. We were doing FISMA for them. This crazy thing called FedRAMP came around right after that. We were
The world got darker.
The world got a lot darker really fast. Rev 3 at that time, right? So no continuous monitoring, no things that we have today in Rev 4 and 5. So kind of started, I was number less than 10. Second platform as a service, Autonomic Resources was the first one to go through. I was the second. Energy was my sponsor. So back in the day, it was kind of the Wild Wild West. Matt Goodrich was still running the PMO. So it was, figured it out, right? Went through that whole process. Sold that company in 2017 after gaining a lot of .govs and on that platform. And then, moved it from Rev 3 to Rev 4. And then after Rev 4, sold the company. Didn't have to deal with going to Rev 5, thank God. Because, if anyone who does FedRAMP knows that, like, doing any kind of impactful change, moving from, like, one operating system to another is difficult. And then, I was crazy enough, I did everything with open source. So I had no...
That is legit insane.
Yeah.
Legit.
Yeah. FIPS was fun on open source.
Yeah.
in the early, this is 2013 and 14, because I got my ATO in 14. So then fast forward a little bit, 19, started this company. As operators, do advising and implementation of really all things that are related to security and compliance.
Yeah,
So,
that's awesome.
What a journey.
Yeah.
Crazy
Experience
times.
matters, right? And I think having experts come in and talk specifically about what are some things that you can do to set you up for success, right? So let's dive into it. So we're actually going through our FedRAMP process right now. Fortunately, we have a pretty awesome team that had experience doing a lot of this before. So it was a lot. We had a lot of easy buttons to push, but easy buttons entails that you know where to start, right? You know what those risks are. So when we started out with our boundary diagram when we were doing FedRAMP. We started out with our boundary diagram. What are the different components that we have inside our system? What are the components that it's going to interact with outside of the system? And even in a simple system like ours that's new and not super bloated, not too much, there's no legacy technology. It's all new. Even for us, mapping that out was daunting.
It's hard.
Daunting.
Yeah.
Say what components am I interacting with? So we've got customer components, and then those need to come into the boundary somehow so that they can interact with your system. So tell us a little bit about that, kind of mapping out data, and what are the considerations that people need to think about starting out?
Yeah, it's where to start is always the hardest, right, for everybody. And to your point, there's one more step you could do before that most people don't. And you think about, do I build it purpose-built or do I retrofit what I got, right? Mm-hmm. So because that's going to drive your boundary diagrams and your data flow diagrams and all those other things. We say internally, if you can't draw it, you're not going to be able to secure it, right? Because you don't know what you got. You don't know what you're doing. If you can't draw a picture of it and draw a picture of it from memory, then you're not going to understand how the pieces work, where things flow, what's important, where controls actually apply. Because you're going to read a control and you're going to that doesn't make sense to me, because you don't understand your architecture enough to be able to apply what it's saying to go do, even though there's examples and there's lots of things out there to tell you on how to apply some piece of compliance or cybersecurity to it. But if you don't understand what you got, then you're starting negative already, right?
Absolutely. I mean, let's dive into that. The alphabet starts with A. Asset management is our first risk when we're thinking about that. So if you don't know what you have, how can you secure it? And by far, that is something that everybody has struggles with, especially because you dealt with FISMA, so you're not dealing with, we have these awesome IaaS components in AWS GovCloud. We don't have to worry about cages. We don't have to worry about all those
the PE controls. PE
right?
controls don't apply to you. You inherit them all.
Right.
Yeah.
We inherit them all. I mean, they apply from a risk perspective, but we've simply transferred the risk to someone else. So that is really hard. But there's more to asset management than just I don't have to worry about the cages. I don't have to worry about the hypervisors. I don't have to worry about uninterruptible power supplies, UPS, whatever it is. I don't have to worry about that, but there is a lot to worry about. You need to be able to inventory your boundary, right, at the very beginning. And people do not appreciate how powerful it is to be able to draw a picture of it at the very beginning. If you can draw a picture of it, then you can probably get the details. But if you can't, that's...
And we talk, and we're talking here a lot about deploying it. You guys deployed. Same thing with our platform. We deployed it on GovCloud as well. There's a lot of inheritance you can happen here. Most of the FedRAMP platforms are not deployed in a public cloud platform that you can inherit from, right? So if you think about that, a lot of them are put in data centers. A lot of them have additional requirements put upon them. Maybe they're interacting with the DoD, so now they have impact levels to deal with. There's a whole bunch, or they're dealing with another entity that says, oh, that's great, you're FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP high. Here's 30 more controls that we have internally that we've written that are maybe based off of NIST, but maybe not, that they feel are important to them based upon their risk tolerance. Again, comes back to risk. That's right. How do you identify, they've identified that in their risk program that is important to them. So now you as a vendor, a third-party vendor, you have to now deal with that with your TPRM, right? So you have to pass that down, or you have to address it and then assume the risk on behalf of your system. And a lot of people don't prepare themselves for that, and they get hit with that out of the gate, and then they can't get a contract because the award is based upon them being able to do this, and they can't.
It's a really good point. Risk. That's what people don't appreciate. With FedRAMP, a lot of people come into this particular industry thinking like, what do I have to do? We want a very black and white, and controls are nice. And I think that's why NIST 800-53 exists, with a control to be operating effectively. It's like you can't be a little bit pregnant, right? Right. It's either working or it's not. And so that's what's so great about NIST is it's like, okay, we already know kind of what the general risk areas are, and they might be in some like awkward named families and everything, but they're there, right? And what they're saying is like, we've already identified all the risks that you need to have, so just do these controls. But people starting there, it's kind of a disadvantage because you do need to think, we talk about this a lot, where is my data? What are the roles or the people that are interacting with that? So where is it deployed? And then what are the components that are processing that data? And so when you get there, you have this little stack, right? If you have this little stack in this little Gov cloud, I have my people, and then I have my data, and my, data, where is it? And then I have the compute or whatever's processing. So I have my people, process, technology, and if you could put a little box around that, that's the risk. And so you need to be very clear about within this little stack, am I sharing the risk with somebody? Am I transferring it totally? And am I fully responsible for addressing all of the risk? And that's why I said you're insane for doing, open source, because you are on the hook for managing all the risk at every level, from physical security. Well, not necessarily with open source, but you do need to know, how do you share that, or do you transfer it? And so you're set up for success with AWS. You alluded to it. When you have someone who's really excellent at managing risk in a certain area, and they have a solution already that helps you do it. And it's just a great time to be doing FedRAMP because there are so many excellent solutions. It's just going to get better and better. It's as good as it is today. It's not perfect. It's the worst it's ever going to be, and it's going to get better and better. So let's talk a little bit about that, right? So you have, let's say, you've mapped out your components. Let's say you have a customer component, comes into a load balancer. That load balancer goes down to goes through some firewall, and then it ultimately goes to a compute, which interacts with a database, interacts with cloud storage. And I'm probably losing a lot of legacy listeners right here, but this is important,
It is.
right?
It is.
So let's just kind of go through a data flow and how you would think about encryption. How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, we always look at it as it's from really outside the authorization boundary is where it starts, right? So you're telling whatever that thing is that's talking to you how to behave with you, right? You're giving it almost like a preset, this is my rules of behavior that I want you to adhere to, and how I expect you to behave. If you don't, I kick you out, right? That's the short of it. So we look at it as encryption starts there, and it's really outside the boundary, and then it flows all the way through really wherever you store the data, right? And that's why that architectural diagram is important, but it doesn't describe data flow, right? So that's why there's two different diagrams. That's why you have to draw it two different ways, is because you may be interacting with a third party through an API that you're not aware of, or you're aware of it, but you don't know how they're interacting with you. So you have to enforce them to do that. If you don't think about that in that way, how are you going to tell them how to behave? You're not, right? They're just going to do it however they feel to do it, and that may be TLS 1.1 and non-FIPS ciphers, right? So and then that gets you into trouble whenever you start enforcing API access to your platform or to any component of your system. It doesn't matter if it's API or whatever it is they're talking to. So that's how we look at it. It's end-to-end. It's top to bottom. It's in transit. It's in flight. It's at rest. It's how you manage your keys. It's whenever someone exports the data, how are they exporting it? What ciphers are they using? Is it encrypted? Is it tagged? Does DLP get involved? There's lots of ways to think about from a risk side, especially for encryption.
So we're on this path of managing risk, okay? And so let's just kind of walk through a path, right? Customer, first thing they need to do is they need to get an IP address. So what's going on there, right? So you're going to go to what, right?
DNS server to get that, because you're going to have some URL or something you're going to hit. Yeah.
And nothing could go wrong there, right?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, DNSSEC could never never mess up your response. And that's welcome to FedRAMP again. DNSSEC has to be everywhere.
Okay, so you got to go get your IP address from something that has DNSSEC. So don't do that on your own, right?
Yeah.
There's already services for that. So Route 53, it's got it implemented by default. Great. Okay, so you get your IP address. Then where are we off to next, right?
Yeah, now you have a URL. So now you're going to connect to some endpoint for something, whether that's HTTP or whatever protocol you're using. Most people use HTTPS, obviously. But so you're going off to an endpoint.
Yep. So you got to have some sort of validation mechanism on your part. Again, rules of behavior, right? That's how you're going to do it.
Yep.
And then it needs to fit with the validation component at the endpoint.
Yeah.
Right? So
TLS validation, right? So you're going to say 1.2, soon to be 1.3. Certain ciphers turned off. Cha-cha doesn't work. So if you're
I don't know cha-cha.
I felt
like that was like a deep geek.
Yeah, that's
that I didn't even know about it.
Sorry, that was one. Yeah. That's one you have to
I know
exclude.
what cha-cha is. Yeah. Why don't we have Mike tell us?
Why don't you tell us what you think that is?
We can see if you're right.
It's a dance that you do in order to get encryption to work. That's
okay.
There we go.
That makes sense.
It's
That's
just
cute.
a cipher. It's a cipher that you have to exclude because it's not FIPS. So it's not FIPS validated.
Okay. Isn't that cute?
Cha-cha. I like
little.
it.
And if you want a good thing to put you to sleep, if you're a tech engineer or whatever you are, if you look at cipher names, they're hilarious. Some of them are really straightforward, like polynomial something or something to do with a math algorithm. And some people get really, really cute and they name them something weird. It's sort of like the IP protocol actually has an RFC by avian carrier. It exists.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can do datagram packets by avian carrier. I'm pretty sure that still is valid. I haven't looked it up in about a decade, but that was always the joke in the late 90s, early 2000s was, if everything else fails, it's SneakerNet or it's avian carrier that you're going to pass the data around with. But
yeah,
love it.
You don't need a PhD. Just talk for 5 minutes, right? And we're like, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. He knows the avian classifications of data.
And the thing is you have to remember, being in the 90s, internet didn't exist in the early 90s the way that anyone ever thinks of it, right? So, even dial-up and SLIP, PPP and SLIP, so those are the two protocols that everyone used for serial connectivity with modems back in the day. Those things, we didn't have high-speed internet. High-speed internet to us was, 28.8 kilobits per second, right? That was the thing. Now we take for granted the fact that we have Fios to our houses and we have gig internet to our houses. Right?
So awesome.
You think about the evolution of the internet from the mid-90s to now, and really over the last probably 5-10 years, it hasn't changed much. Speeds have increased a little bit. The next leap's going to be quantum. It's already starting. We see that in FedRAMP. Obviously, you have to start doing cipher. Mm-hmm. There's a whole piece of that. You have to talk about your ciphers.
Can you imagine building that yourself?
No.
You can't do that.
No.
Yeah, so
that requires a PhD.
Yeah, we're going to be more and more and more interconnected, and so therefore you kind of got to know what you got. So you've got, okay, so we've made the hop to the load balancer, and that's where, if it's your company, right, that's where you're going to have a lot of responsibility. If you do it open source like this masochist, you have to build that, right?
Okay. HA proxy for the win.
Right.
That's what we used.
Okay, that sounds awful.
It was.
And then so you can use an application load balancer or an ELB. So AWS allows you can use AWS's cipher suite. So you're in there, but then you're going to go through maybe some firewall rules, right? And then you're getting to some sort of web endpoint, right?
Yeah, and it's usually another layer proxy, right? So it's a proxy with another proxy. And then you actually get to get the application code.
Yep.
Applying different layers of things. Remember, compliance and security is always layers We always talk about that, right? So no one layer should be its own thing.
Yep.
It all should have redundancy.
Yep. Okay. And then all right, so I'm here and now I'm at this compute endpoint, and now I'm going to start fetching data. I'm going to start storing data. I'm going to start processing data and putting that in some database. And so there's going to be some there's going to be data at rest there. Yep. There's also going to be cloud storage. So talk a little bit about that. Is FIPS important in transit there?
All of it. Yeah. If it's a move-in, it needs to be FIPS, right? So that's, and not FIPS certified, FIPS validated. Remember, that's, if you can't reference it on this website and their list of certificate numbers, if you can't get the certificate number, then guess what? It doesn't matter. Right?
What if you had a cool application that stored all those CMBPs? Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, that would be pretty cool.
That'd be pretty cool.
I wonder if there's one. Wait a second. I know of one of those. I think it's you guys. Yeah.
Anyway, so you have that, right? I remember that used to be like everything, it's a pretty flat network once you get past the hard crunchy shell, right? And that's a problem, right? Because you need even that's what we call east-west traffic, right? So we described north-south traffic in nerd terms, right? Like getting into the network. And then once you're inside, it's the east-west. And all of that has to be encrypted in transit. But then again, at rest, right? So you need to use components that have FIPS validated modules to encrypt at rest, right? So
and the other issue you have there is east versus west. Before it used to be that you were in the trusted space, right? So you didn't have to worry about once you're inside the door, you're inside the door, right? So that has changed. That's changed over the last probably 5 years, right? So now you're inside the door, but now you want to enforce encryption east-west. You also want to enforce roles. You also want to enforce security groups, NACLs, whatever you can do to make sure that traffic is truly what it's supposed to be and not something that someone is just inside running amok.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so this is all very complicated, and 20 years ago required really large teams, NetEng teams, DevOps. Before Dev, I guess they didn't. Did they ever call it DevOps?
No, it wasn't DevOps. It was just ops. You were a network engineer and a system engineer, and that was it.
And then DBAs, right?
Yeah, lots of DBAs.
Yeah. So this is all really because everybody has to do their own thing and specialize. Now we have really advanced cloud components that can do all of this. So maybe to kind of wrap a bow around this whole this example of a data flow of a customer coming from outside to inside, and how you're dealing with encryption. What are some easy wins, right?
Inheritance, right? 100% inherit as much as you can. Obviously, again, like I said, most platforms are not using a public cloud. Some, I shouldn't say most. I'll say most. Most aren't using public clouds. So they can't inherit. So there's things that you have to do in order to make that happen regardless, right? So that's the first thing is just know what you can inherit and what you can't. Acknowledge that because some of those things could be pretty big boulders for you to overcome. And that's usually where we start. Where we figure out things is what is this system doing? How's it working? Again, going back to the data flow diagram, going back to their authorization boundary diagram, figuring out where is those places at, right? What can we do? And if they're using things like VMware or they're using from a technology perspective, there's already well-documented ways to put all this stuff and turn it on. Where it comes an issue is your workload, right? So whatever workload you're using, if you're using containers with, let's say you have Docker hosts and you're running containers on top of that or using Kubernetes, the way that you apply these things to a Kubernetes host is different than how you apply them to the container itself, is different than how you can apply it to the hypervisor it may be running on versus the infrastructure it's also hosted on. So thinking about that as layers, if you can't inherit, then that means that you have to secure all those things equally, not just one of them. And that's what most people get findings on is they get 3 out of 4 or 2 out of 4, and they miss it because they didn't think about it.
Because they didn't think about it in the beginning. And,
exactly right.
You didn't. You're just going to miss things if you try to do it all by yourself.
Yep.
Right. The odds are stacked against you, or it's going to take you a really, really long time. And so the odds that you find someone that knows everything there is to know about networks, knows everything there is to know about database, about all of those things, and encryption and all of that stuff it's just so low, and so the ads are stacked against you. And then describing it, right? Because like people need to know, how do I know this is in place, and am I being consistent with the way I'm describing it? Am I telling lies? Am
I burying my skeletons, right? That's usually what gets you, is you think that you're burying your skeleton, and then an auditor comes in and says, show me evidence. And you're like, oh, there's my skeleton.
Yeah, they're going to find it, right? And then you have to kind of go all the way back, right? You have to go all the way back, and just planning and all that stuff. Oh, it's just so important.
And the worst part about that is if they find that skeleton, then what does that skeleton mean for your timeline, right? So auditors, if you've ever gone through an audit before, you get blocks of time. You're in that window. If you need to slide to the right of that window and move it out, chances are, especially in FedRAMP, you're on a 6-month time delay, right? Before you get your next window. It just adds another 12 months to your entire cycle. And if you have a plan going into it, again, focusing on the plan, what you got, how you're going to do it, put the time in up front before all that happens, you're going to have a lot better chance of getting through it. And to your point, if you've never been through it before, or you have been through it before, but it's like an earlier revision of NIST, there's a lot of uplift there, right? So just either hire someone, find an advisory service company, find someone who's going to help you, an engineer that knows how to do it, find someone, right? And that's, get yourself some help.
And get a great auditor. Honestly, do not skimp there. Make sure that your auditor is excellent. We have the best, right? Like we have one of the best auditors ever. And we talked about, authentication to just the web app, and I'm like, non-privileged users, and our auditors were like, hey, you're going to need to have a FIPS key, YubiKey for everybody. I'm like, even for listen, we've seen this, we've been through this a lot, and we're like, you know what, I trust you. That's great. We'll lock it down even more. And, it's not so bad, right? Some hurt feelings on the sales team.
Yeah, we're hurt. We're good over it. I think a lot of people don't realize, though, that the auditor you choose ends up being more than just, testing to make sure you're doing the right things. They kind of become your advocate. And so if you're not picking the right one in the beginning, it can, A, cause you problems if they're not helping you scope correctly from the beginning, but then B, even later on, you can run into issues once you get to agency and PMO and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's, to your point there, too, it's pretty easy to find out who the successful ones are. FedRAMP is amazing from that perspective, as it's all open, right? Just go on fedramp.gov. You can pull it up by 3PA list, find out who has the most. You can find out who has the least, right? And then you can go, oh, okay, it is a little bit of a herd mentality, and you do get what you pay for in this situation. So if someone is giving you a quote that is extremely low, then you're probably going to be
You'll pay for it.
You're going to pay for it in the end, right? And there is some normalization of price inside of there, but it's across the board. To your point, Mike, it is important to find someone who has the relationships, has the understanding, has the experience with all of this, because it is super complex and it's super long. And what you'll pay for is not just only dollars; it's also time, and then time to market is going to suffer because of that too, because now you're paying for it longer to be running with no customers. That means that now it just makes the whole thing worse for you.
Yeah, the team matters. And we were talking about this earlier today too. Talk to us about, if somebody making all this actionable for a company that wants to go get FedRAMP, and they're saying, okay, I got to get the right people in place. Like, what should that team look like?
Yeah, so that's a different question for different people. Like, it's a different answer for different companies, right? So it all depends upon what you're trying to do and what level of inheritance you can do. If you're doing a lot of things yourself and you have to put a lot of things in yourself, that's going to be a very technical heavy team, both from a compliance analyst perspective and as I'm going to call them system engineers. It's someone who's going to implement the technology, right? Whatever that is, in order to answer those compliance things. It really comes, for me, someone should be able to answer the question of what 3PO should I pick? What tools do I need to have in place? It's not all about just one tool to solve all problems. It's not that way. It's a multitude of things that you have to do, whether it's documentation, whether it's vulnerability management, whether it's insider threat detection or alerting or monitoring or just hosting your stuff. It's all inclusive. So having someone who understands this process, either an outside person or someone you hire, that's key, number one, right? And they have to be technical and compliance focused. It has to be both, because really at the end of the day, they're a system architect. Really at the end of the day, right? They're system architecting the compliance program along with the cybersecurity side, along with the IT infrastructure. So it becomes a whole one-stop thing.
I want to get back a little bit more into actually risk solutions and addressing the different things that we're at. So we went through a quick little theoretical data flow, right? And it's totally theoretical, right? Totally. Yeah, totally. So we went through that. One thing I wanted to point out there, you mentioned briefly, do I build this? Do I take what I have right now and make sure FIPS is on something that's already legacy and complex, or do I repurpose in a new system? And that's actually pretty tricky for some people because costs are going to go up regardless.
Yep.
Because security is, it's going to cost some money to do that. Talk about that. When does it make sense just to have one system versus let's have a special purpose network?
Yeah, I think it comes down to complexity of what that thing is, right? So in encryption perspective, whenever we move from dash two or from 2 to 3 as an example, right? So that's going to be something that you would want to take a look at and say, how hard is this going to be? Right? Is it moving from TLS 1.2 to 1.3? Does everything that's interacting with this allow that to happen? If you think about from a Microsoft perspective or an AWS perspective, when you get alerts and you get warnings, all the admins get a warning saying that this is something that's going to occur. We're going to switch out TLS from this version to this version over time. And they're doing that because they're also dealing with compliance woes, right? So, or no different than if you're using Fargate in AWS, they require you to restart a task. Well, why do they do that? Because they have a vulnerability on their Docker host, and they had to patch the Docker host. And guess what? Your container that was living on this host is now, it's going to die. They're going to kill it. They're going to re-provision it with all the patches on it, but they have to evacuate all the workloads.
Right.
So now by you restarting your task, puts you on the scheduler, puts you on another host. Voila, you're now patched. Right. So. All those processes all kind of go together, right? So if you can use that, if you can leverage that as much as you can, having someone else deal with that, right? That's the key, right?
Imagine?
So
That's the key.
because it's same thing with you guys. Like your platform does a very specific thing as part of this process. Is it an end all to be all to get you from front to back? No. But does it save you 3 months of time? Yes, it does. I mean, and that's the thing is you're trying to look at levers that you can pull to make you go at a faster rate with higher accuracy.
That's right.
And that's across no matter what part of this journey you're doing. Doesn't matter what part of your business you're dealing with. This can be applied everywhere, right? From a technology, compliance, finance, sales ops, rev ops, it's all of it.
That's right. Man, that's awesome. I love it. Yeah, okay. Okay, so we're here. We're in the boundary. And this is the customer, but it's not just customers that access this environment. In fact, it's a lot more complex than that.
Yep.
So our admins, we're going to have some sort of privileged access management there, right?
Yep.
People get this wrong really easy.
All the time. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So let's describe kind of ideally in the ideal scenario, how should you manage identities for your admins?
Yeah, so most people think of this as people. This isn't a people thing, right? It's very much a role thing. Don't say Bob Smith from engineering is what you're trying to apply this to.
That's right.
It's not Bob Smith. It is a role that you're going to assign with certain rights inside of it, and then Bob just happens to be in that group, right? Bob could be in 5 groups, right?
Yeah.
But what's going to happen is the system's going to force him to change from role to role behind the scenes, right? So if you start tackling that problem as a role and you define what that role should do, so read only is really easy, right? You can only read, and it's only read access to certain things. Maybe they only have read access to S3 buckets, or maybe they have it to only to entry groups, or being able to see from a compliance perspective access logs, right? So maybe they're like a SOC analyst. That role only has that thing. You could have 50 roles, right? You could have, and they're as granular or not granular as you want. It doesn't say that you have to, compliance doesn't say that you have to do it a certain way. Compliance just says you have to do it. Right? You have to have roles. And you have to do least privilege access. And if you can show that and demonstrate it, that's up to you to implement.
Yeah.
Right? That is something in your control plane, not the compliance of the auditors. As long as you can prove it to say that Bob or Susie or whoever that is needs that access in order to complete their job function.
That's right. And the temptation is to give Jeff one more permission. Yes, he has this role, but just to give him a one-off permission. Don't do that.
Don't do that. Make
right?
a role.
Make a role.
Because I guarantee you, Mike is going to need that next role, right? Jeff, and now you have to go back and then rework that. And that just becomes a nightmare to try. Then it's a whole nother change process and you throw it away.
I believe I was doing a role audit in SAP when I started questioning the decisions of my life, in San Jose.
You said SAP first. That was
yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm like, what have I done?
Yeah.
And that the whole story, I'm just giving you a little more color to I made a terrible mistake, that kind of thing. Okay. So another thing that I've seen, and tell me if you've seen something different, is the decision do you modify these in a console within AWS, within an application, or can you codify those roles in a Terraform script or something like that, right? Yeah. Where you can have all of this go under change management. Because for us, what I really like is everything is infrastructure as code, right? So our roles within IAM in Amazon, and Amazon's been awesome about this, is I can actually set that through a Terraform script, and then every week when we're doing our change management review board, we're looking at, okay, hey, we need to update this role. We're doing it in code, and there was a change ticket associated with that, and it's approved and everything like that. That when you have it with roles, it's just superior in every way, and it's really easy to show the justification for why things are the way they are. Versus if you just have an admin, that's better than having everybody have access, but having an admin go into a console and change a role and then manually look for a ticket and approval and all that stuff, that just sucks, right? So I don't know.
What you just described was marrying compliance and IT together, right? You just took a process that has always been manually done, and you just eliminated someone's 2 to 15-minute job to validate that happened, and then you can easily provide logs to say this is how it was.
Yep.
Right. So, and that's important. That is super important, because if you can leverage that, you can leverage that. Now, again, if you're doing an on-prem system, you may not have that ability. Right. You may have to do that a little bit differently. It's not as easy as just running Terraform.
And that just sucks. So get out of the on-prem.
Yeah. But a lot of people won't move off-prem because they can't. Right. I mean, there's something that's dragging them down. Either the costs are killing them. It's just cheaper to do on. Maybe they have other compliance concerns other than FedRAMP. Maybe they're going for IL5 or something else that is going to cause them to have other things that are impacting that ability. And AWS has, and Azure Government and all the clouds that do this have all these things as well. You can inherit, but there may be some business reason why you can't. And that's important. The answer is yes, do it in code if you possibly can. If you can't, make those one-offs and make sure you document the snot out of them, right? Because if you don't, then your compliance people are going to kill you when it comes time to audit.
Yeah, and that flexibility is important when you're approaching security planning, because there are things I'll never forget. We had a new guy come with Paramify, and we were really excited about our brand new intake process. We're like, this is going to be great. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And so we're like, okay, yeah. So we're starting with planning, right? We always do. Yeah, so where are you deployed? And they're like, yeah, do you remember that? Yep.
AWS, Azure, managed data center, my mom's closet.
Yeah.
This computer I'm carrying in my bag right now. Yeah.
And you're just like, oh, well, yeah.
I'm going to be able to solve for about a third of that equation.
Yeah.
But that is like so much risk. But what came down to is like the technology today didn't exist, right? So, we're talking about needing, gosh, what is it? Freaking telephones. I can't, like, some things just aren't. They're like legacy technology, right? And they just don't exist in the major clouds yet. Or if they do, they're not FedRAMP authorized.
Exactly.
Yep. And so there's services that are new.
And that comes back to one of the other bigger things that we fight a lot is technical debt, right? Mm-hmm. So this is how we've always done it. This is how we've done it. This is how we're going to continue to do it. And then they get to an audit and they're like, no, we can't do that anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So now, or something happens like an end of life piece of software, an operating system. Whenever 2012 Windows went out. That caused a ripple effect across the whole environment, right? Because a lot of people were leveraging that to deliver services. Same thing with Red Hat and CentOS. Whenever CentOS got killed, a lot of people were using CentOS to do stuff. And whenever 7 finally came end of life, because Red Hat pulled them in and then decided to end that program, a lot of people were still, now you're paying for rail licenses that weren't paying for that before. Now it's an added expense. Now I have to move to 9. What does 9 mean? Does that have a FIPS validated piece? It doesn't. Right?
No.
I think it actually just got through this month, I think. But
we'll talk about that, right? Because FedRAMP says, we're saying like, hey, this needs to be FIPS validated. And you say, well, it's brand new. It's not FIPS, but it's actually the more secure. But it's not FIPS validated, so that's a challenge, right? So it's just important to be able to have all that be taken care of for you. Like, the documentation and everything and the justifications for like, hey, this is a stronger encryption is just not through the actual FIPS validation process.
And the other problem is that you won't pass an audit if it's just certified, right? It has to be validated. So that whole thing, that's the first thing that happens is that, you'll leverage those newer operating systems or use those newer technologies, and then you get to your audit and that's a finding, right? And then you have to go back and you have to unwind it, especially if you're using like either instances in Azure or using AWS EC2 instances or whatever, or even serverless stuff. Those things all are impacted by that. So like if you think like deploying Ubuntu Pro as an example,
the other
which has like a USG command on there that actually will apply STIGs for you as much as you can.
What are STIGs?
Do we have to go down that path?
No.
I did say those 3 letters, didn't I?
No, that's all right.
Yeah, it's the other S word.
It's all right.
But yeah, I mean, if you had like leverage the things that you can leverage as much as you can, but there's certain things that you're not going to be able to.
Right. Well, and that's a problem, right? So if you have legacy tech, it's not just this. It's not just setting up FIPS, coming into the boundary, setting up access, setting up configuration management. Yeah, that's all has to happen, and that's hard enough. But as if that's not hard enough, now do your legacy components, do those actually report to your SIEM? Oh, no. Well, there's no way to put a Splunk forwarder on that, or there's no way to do that. So you have all of this risk, and it just mounts up because you not only do you have to control the access and the change in the environment, you also have to monitor that. And so there's all sorts of freaking cool tech with like SentinelOne and Splunk and CrowdStrike and all these other really cool tech, right? That's out there. But when you have legacy system, it's hard to use it, and so you have to have one-off, and then you have to expand your workforce, and then that just increases the error, and it increases. It's just more risk that is on you to mitigate versus inherit, right? So there's absolutely a theme here. So what are some of the gotchas that you find in like event monitoring? Kind of before we get into like all the
people not doing it. That's number one. I mean, or they just usually, like anything that you do, including what we just talked about, think about what you want to pull into your event monitoring, into your SIEM, what do you want to look for?
Some criteria.
What are you required to look for?
Mm-hmm.
Am I just collecting this to be a hoarder? Right. That should always be question 3 or 4. Anytime you start talking about event collection, am I just doing this because I want to, or am I doing this because I think that I should and I don't have to? Evaluate that against some criteria, because SIMs aren't cheap. Right. We all know this. Whether you're using, it used to be it was only Logarithm, Splunk, as an option. That's no longer the case. We heavily use Splunk. We see Splunk everywhere because it's been around for so long. It works, but it's not the only solution anymore, right? You have, to Kenny's point, you have SentinelOne, CrowdStrike. You have all these other
Thank goodness, man.
All these different things, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have to just use one thing, and each of these have a separate unit of cost, right? And cost is not only just dollars, right? Mm-hmm. It's dollars, it's time, it's automation, it's all the things.
Does it work right for your environment?
And does it meet what you're trying to get as a governance goal?
Yeah.
Right. So if your governance goal is to meet this certain level of compliance, then all of those things that you're trying to push that risk onto has to meet the same level of compliance governance that you do.
Yeah. And I think, can you guys just tell, like listeners, just like stop for a second. And this is so hard to do on your own, right? Yeah. It is so hard to do on your own. And you need to make it, it's hard enough. Why make it harder for yourself, right? Just really understand what it is that you just need to understand the risk. And if you don't, do not abdicate it to a consultant that you don't understand or don't trust, right? Like, risk management is for anyone. It's not for everyone.
Yeah, exactly.
You cannot abdicate things. Otherwise, you get a mediocre result. Anything in business, right? So it's really important you understand that.
And to your point, most people, I'm going to say, unless someone is forced to, and someone being an entity, unless an entity is forced to think about this stuff, they're not going to do it, right? Because this isn't, it's sort of like, I'm not going to go and do this thing just because I want to. That isn't what this stuff is, right? Someone's telling you that your revenue is dependent upon you doing this. Mm-hmm. So it has to be revenue backed. And I think that's the most education that we do a lot of times is people come into initial conversations, and they think about this and they're like, well, we'd like to have it because we think it's cool. It's not cool.
It's not.
It's actually the worst.
And it's one of those things, as soon as you start describing it, they realize it's really a clown with a balloon hiding in a sewer, right? It's just ready to take your soul, and that's it.
Probably nothing.
Right. and that's the nature of anything that we do as humans is we're not going to do something unless we either enjoy it or we have to do it, right? Mm-hmm. So this isn't an enjoyment thing.
Yeah.
And you're not going to do it if you don't have to do it because your revenue is not dependent upon it, right? So
why make it harder?
If some sales guy comes to you and says, hey, I think we should have FedRAMP because I think I can sell it, don't just take that and run with it. Do some research, right? This beautiful thing of AI that we have today, spend literally free on Claude or OpenAI. Go type into what do I have, what does FedRAMP mean? Or what does IL mean? Or what is that thing that you don't know? Google search it. Do some basic research and just understand that A, it's not easy, B, it's not cheap, and C, it's long.
And the other thing too, I'd say, is it's not inevitable. Companies fail all the time. Big organizations fail all the time, and there are real costs with it. There's money in it. There's people in it. There's programs in it. There's deals in it. There's a lot. Yeah.
And what we don't normally see is the trickle-down effect of that. Right. So I'll use the Boeing strike as an example. Right. So that just wrapped up this Monday. Right. Workers are going to start to go back. They reached a deal. But for 7 weeks, that wasn't the case. So think about it from Boeing as an organization building aircraft. Right. So how many organizations feed things into Boeing to build aircraft? Think about it from just down to the rivet. Right.
There's the landing gear. There's.
There's just
not that much.
Yeah, it's just a couple
wheels.
parts.
That's really all it is, right?
Yeah, and some jet fuel. But those things all have impactful downflows to other people, right? And down to, I'm going to guess, even healthcare providers where those workers are, because all the health benefits were lost, during that strike. So that means that people aren't spending money. All those businesses that they were usually going to go out to eat, getting, pedicures or getting your hair cut or things that we all didn't do during the pandemic, right? That we weren't allowed to do because they weren't open, right? Think about that in a microcosm type of a bubble that has that impact all because, something happened. I'm not saying it was not warranted or justified or anything. I'm just saying from the effect of that thing, there's a lot of trickle-down effect that happens as well. And a lot of people don't think about that, right? And then they get impacted by it. No different than the Change Healthcare issue that happened, what was that, this year. When it didn't really impact anybody until they couldn't get their prescription drugs mailed to them, right? And because what happened is they lost all their products. They couldn't get, no one could do billing, no one could do claims adjudication, no one could get prescriptions, you couldn't schedule appointments. I mean, the whole thing, right? So, and everyone was so reliant on one system to do all those things, the trickle-down effect is there. This has the same thing.
Yeah.
Right? It's
supply
the same
chain.
process. It's very much like supply chain.
And supply chain exists in tech also.
It does.
Right? 100%. Big time. And that was honestly the major thing to Revision 5. We talked briefly about going from Rev 4 to Rev 5. A lot of it was kind of annoying because like Part A went to Part E and some things, some of those, like all that work we did on the I forget, like the voice over IP controls. No one cares anymore. Those are all gone. Those are all gone.
10 years ago, people cared about that.
People cared about them.
Yeah.
Those are all gone, right, from Rev 4, Rev 5, but like at least in FedRAMP. But supply chain, SR for supply chain. Supply chain risk management. That's important. So we have our environment. Now we've installed Sentinel-1. We have events, and now we see like, oh, this looks like it's finding things like, hey, this is really old tech that you have in here, or like it found this vulnerability, or something worse, you got installed, right? Like, oh crap, so managing that supply chain, again, you need to be able to draw a picture of it. But also, if you draw a picture of it, what is that connected to? What are you depending on? Right? Talk a little bit about that, right?
Yeah.
Vulnerabilities. Yeah.
And so we do more than just FedRAMP. That's our main focus. But like anything FedRAMP, impact levels, CMC, those type of federal frameworks. But we look at supply chain no different than third-party risk, right? So it's the same thing. It's just a subset.
Yep.
It's still the same process. You set up the program the same way. You potentially could be doing more automated checks than what you do typically with vendors. Typically on a third party, you would just look at your vendors once or twice a year. Mm-hmm. But with this, for software and providers are applying stuff for a platform, that becomes a lot more impactful, right? So you should be doing it more than twice a year, right? So that's where the differences really come down to. It's automatable. And then on top of that, it's something you should be doing continuously, not something that you're doing, sporadically.
Awesome. Yeah. So what are some of the maxims we can gather from this discussion? Experience matters.
Experience matters. Don't go at it alone.
Start correctly.
Yep.
And if you don't know something, don't just go, oh, it'll be fine. Let's push through and do it, because eventually that's going to come through in the form of some sort of finding from an auditor.
If you can't draw it, you can't secure it.
If you can't draw it, you can't secure it. I love that.
Yeah.
All right. I love it. If you can't draw it, you can't secure it.
And you can't talk about it.
You
right?
can't talk about it.
Whenever you're in front of the auditor for those in-person interviews that we all love to do, and they're starting to needle you to death on how did you do this? How did you do this? If you can't, they're going to pick up on that. Right.
Yeah.
So if they pick up on that, then they start digging other places. And if they start digging other places because they feel that you don't know what you're doing on this, because everything's linked, right? So now your trustworthiness is starting to sink as someone who's built this thing, and that's their whole job is to be a detective.
Yep.
And if you don't, you can do it, but it just makes your process that much harder.
It's already hard enough.
It is.
Right. Yeah. I think, so some quick wins is like maybe some practical takeaways. And this is what we did, right? Start with your boundary diagram, draw it out, and be really clear on your entire stack of what are you doing for SIM? What are you doing for vulnerability management inside? What are you scanning? is FIPS possible on each of those components? And these things that we've talked about today, draw it out and make sure you know what that is. And if you don't, you've got to know before you engage auditors. And then when you do engage your auditor, like we did, we're like, okay, here it is. Like, and Nick's like, this looks awesome. You got one problem. This service over here is not FedRAMP authorized.
Yep.
Not even it. This isn't FedRAMP High authorized. I'm like, yeah, but it's moderate. Like, doesn't matter. You're
That's
going
well
for
said.
FedRAMP High. Has to be the same thing. And so that is, yes, we said like, yes, FedRAMP, it's changing. Things are changing, right? CMMC's coming into effect. There is a FedRAMP equivalency, which is insane, bonkers, no POAMs. Hello, that's hard. There is a lot of today still, if you're going for the high watermark, that's going to be a differentiator for you in the enterprise security space, because even if you don't sell to government, guess what? The enterprises that you sell to, they're selling to the government. And if they're using you, especially if you're part of the DevOps process or part of security or anything, you will need to have that FedRAMP authorization. And particularly more and more, it's high. Because when I remember, Mike, we
had our wish list.
Yeah, we were like, so it's August 2nd. We decided. So today, what's today?
November 6th.
Yeah, so November 6th. So a few months ago, we were like, we lost a deal for that same reason. I'm like, yeah, but we're not. We had an enterprise that was like, hey, we love you and everything. We're excited. We'd already gone through procurement even. But what happened is the IT said, hey, as easy as it is to deploy Paramify in there, I wish you the best, but we're not going to do it. We don't want to manage it. We don't want to manage the POAMs or anything.
You didn't get the box checked.
And I'm like,
right?
dude, come on, man. Like, you love us. Dude, we're friends. I mean, we talked. Like, we had food and drinks. Like, come on. And it didn't matter. We weren't FedRAMP High, so we're like, okay, that's it. From this day forward. Right. And so that was August 2nd.
That was August 2nd.
We go to our conference. I'm like going out. I'm like just like wide-eyed looking out at all the vendors. I'm like, I can get any of these. And I'm like, wait a minute. Blow them all away. I can get none of these.
There was like two options.
There were two options. And they're awesome options, right? The winners knew about this in the first place, but like still, right? You're going to hear more and more about FedRAMP. It's going to be more and more important.
Yeah, now that it's in law, right? I mean, we're 2 years in from it becoming law, I think, something like that. That allowed it to get funding. That allowed it to get all kinds of stuff behind it. That allows it to expand. They're already talking about automation. We're talking about OSCAL, being in 25, 26. Finally, we're starting to see some digital transformation to a project. A government project has been around for 10 years.
Yeah.
Right? And it's needed it.
Yep.
It's only kept up with things that NIST has been keeping up with only because it's had to, not because it's wanted to. Now it's starting to make its own thing in its own way. Mm-hmm. And because of the dependence, there's a lot of other things. Now that it's law, they're starting to depend on it. CMC being an example, other things being an example. Like, no one's going to talk to you for IL4 or 5 if you don't have FedRAMP, right? It's not going to happen. It's just too much of a heavy lift, and that's the key.
Let it be written that Jason knew FedRAMP. He knew it before it was cool. He knows before.
Is it cool now?
I was going to say, we actually probably also know it before it's cool, but it will be cool someday.
Yeah, what do we say about Param? But Param, FedRAMP's pretty cool. We're smart and we're witty. We sag our pants a little bit, right? It's kind of cool.
Yeah, I agree. Look, it's to me, it's been a long road. It's changed a lot. If you're just coming into it now, it's a very different program than it was 10 years ago for good reasons. There's still a lot of room for advancement, right? I mean, the whole fact of things need to be more static than dynamic needs to change, right? I mean, containers are difficult. Anything that's serverless is difficult, more difficult than it should be. So I think the next couple of years we're going to see a lot of improvement. But like anything with the government, it's glacial speed, right? It's going to change. It's going to change when it wants to change, not when you want it to.
So. Deal with it. Man, awesome. Thanks, Jason. Dude, we appreciate you as a friend and partner, and future's bright for all of us. I'm really excited for where you guys are going. Super excited. Where can our listeners find a little bit more about Steel Patriot Partners and how to reach out to you?
Yeah, so you can find us on our website, www.steelpatriotpartners.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Jason Ford. You'll find me. There's not many of me. I am not the NFL running back that lives in California. I'm also not the doctor that lives in California. But yeah, you can find me there. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest thing to find me for.
That's great.
Love it.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks, guys.
See ya.